Hi, thanks for choosing to watch this video about a very heated conversation topic in the world of operations right now. And that's the topic of tracking your employees' location in the workplace. So, my name's John, and as well as dabbling in marketing, I've also been writing and reporting on workplace issues now in various publications and places for the last 15 years or so. So my background's in journalism, PR and marketing predominantly. Why then am I interested in talking about location tracking technology? Well, as mentioned, I have a journalistic interest in workplace issues, as well as an interest in how people perceive things. And when I first started working with Sense, I quickly started to suspect that there were some very strong opinions on the subject of tracking, especially location tracking, which were bubbling away under the surface. And so last year, I decided to run a fun little marketing experiment, if you will, on LinkedIn, and I created a set of deliberately controversial ads such as this one. Okay, so paying for hours that aren't being worked, location intelligence for the workplace. That was the simple nature of the advert. As a marketing, communications and PR type person, I'm constantly interested in how people perceive things. I'm also interested in how different types of language can make this come across. So my suspicion was that whenever a person hears a word such as tracking or even location intelligence, which is how we more commonly refer to it in our company, they actually hear other words such as mistrust, micromanagement, invasion of privacy. And so I decided to tap into these fears with this ad campaign, using stereotypical images such as this white male construction worker having a sneaky smoke break during his shift. Now, we were basically suggesting that location intelligence lets you save 5 minutes here or 5 minutes there, because it shows you who is or isn't working, or perhaps who is or isn't in the smoking shelter, which, by the way, is not actually the point of the Sense system, but it was the point of this ad. I created this ad campaign to see just how strongly people felt about location tracking. I suspected strong opinions, and I got strong opinions. I'm going to show you some of my favourite comments that we got on this advert. Who fits the tag on your ankle then? Whatever happened to trust in the workplace? Bringing Victorian sweatshops into the modern era. And perhaps my personal favourite here is, for F's sake, let a man have a cigarette. Many of the other comments that we got were probably not really appropriate to put on this presentation. But we did attract over 50 comments during the course of this campaign, which for what we spent was actually an awful lot of engagement, even if that engagement was fairly awful. So this ad campaign proved to me that people do have a strong gut reaction to the idea of location tracking, especially in the workplace. But why do we hear the word tracking and immediately think of spying? Are we reacting to what it actually is, or are we reacting to what we think it is? And these fears are not irrational. They're based on history and culture, and there's lots of examples of how these two words have become connected over the years. I'm only going to bring up a few. But one example is that for the last 75 years, George Orwell's book, 1984, has burned the phrase, "Big Brother is watching you," into our shared cultural memory. Just one mention of that word tracking does tend to trigger an image of this sort of dystopian world from this book. Or maybe it just makes you think of AJ and Will from the popular TV show. I don't know. Another example, many of us are very familiar with so-called productivity tools designed to track mouse movement, keystrokes, or even take random screenshots as you go about your working day, supposedly to prove to your boss that you're not actually slacking off. Now, this so-called bossware, as I've heard it referred to, is something that's actually offered as standard on many freelancing platforms. Now, I tend to switch these off the moment I hire somebody on a place like that, because personally, I don't need to know that a person is at their desk for every single minute they're billing me for. I realise that a lot of the productivity happens away from the screen and away from the desk. But anyway, that's another debate. Another example I want to just quickly mention is how in recent years Amazon has been taking flack for tracking their drivers' activity, to the point where some drivers have been reporting getting flagged for or penalised for stopping too long, even if it's just to stretch, breathe, or take a bathroom break. And of course, the effect of all these examples tends to be that tracking feels like nothing more than a cruel invasion of our privacy, with the sole goal of working us all to death. So it might sound weird to hear me say it. After all, don't I represent a tracking company myself? But tracking employee location is not always a good thing. If your only goal with tracking is to squeeze every ounce of life out of a person, then my opinion on this matter is that you're using employee tracking wrong. Employee tracking technology wrong, should I say. So, what if location tracking actually helped both the employer and the employee? What if it was less of an us versus them tool and more of a, let's see how we can all work together tool? So location technology doesn't have to mean surveillance, it doesn't have to mean micromanagement, and it certainly shouldn't be implemented because you don't trust a person you've hired. That should be solved by hiring the right person in the first place. What location technology can mean, however, and I'm going to explain how, is fairness, protection, speed, and trust. So I'd like to take you through 4 real-world examples of how location technology is being used for the right reasons to bring big business benefits. And as I've said, not only to the employer, the ops manager, the team leader, but also to the workers themselves who are being tracked. So I'm going to start with the most obvious use case for tracking your employees' location, and that is the case for proving that they are where they say they are, or were where they said they were when they supposedly did a job or a task. But in this particular case, we're not talking about proof from a micromanagement point of view. Rather, we're talking about a large facilities management company who actually implemented our Sense Presence location system in order to provide proof of work for their clients. So they weren't trying to penny pinch from their own workforce, rather they were trying to defend the effort of their workforce when clients had questions about whether or not certain jobs had been attended. So our client is a large facilities management company operating throughout UK and Europe. To give you an idea of the kind of work they do, they send large cleaning crews into office spaces all over the country. Now, they had a big problem when it came to verifying the work being completed by their cleaners. And no, it wasn't that their operations managers didn't personally trust their cleaning crews. It was actually that they couldn't control their clients' perception when it came to whether or not work had been carried out. For example, maybe one of their clients would turn up to their office, see that something had been knocked to the floor or a mug that somebody had left on a windowsill, and automatically jump to the conclusion that the cleaners had not attended their shift, or at least had not been in that particular room. Now, almost all of the time, this was not true. Either the cleaner had simply missed a spot, it happens, or more often, the mess had been made by somebody after the cleaner had already finished their shift. But of course, this is difficult to prove, and once the end client has this perception of mistrust, it becomes very difficult to reassure them that attendance did take place. And partly that's because the methods that most places have in place right now, such as manual sign-in sheets or scannable paper barcodes, these can be easily manipulated, backdated, cheated. So we end up with work that has been done but cannot be verified. That's the first problem. They've done the work, but they've not been able to verify that they've done the work. And what this often leads to is an end client that challenges a cleaning team's timesheet. They challenge whether that work has been done. They complain, meaning an investigation for the FM company who's holding the contract. And what that leads to is oftentimes a cleaner who's already struggling to make ends meet, by the way, on little more than minimum wage, now having their timesheet challenged and having to fight to prove that they actually turned up to work so that they can get paid what they owed. So when this particular client implemented Sense, they wanted to see where each member of their cleaning crews were, what time they arrived at the end client's site, what time they left, what jobs they did and what rooms they visited while they were doing those jobs. And the reason for that was not to penny pinch on their cleaners' timesheets, but it was rather so that they could verify proof of work in order to reduce disputes and complaints from their end client, leading to timesheets that never needed defending or arguing about in, I'd say, about 99% of the cases. Now, of course, there was a handful of cases where the complaint is actually about the quality of work. This still leads to disputes and arguments. But implementing Sense reassured the majority of this company's end clients that the cleaners were at least on site, leading to far fewer complaints and a much faster resolution for those complaints that still made it through. So I believe this is a very good use of location tracking in the workplace to reassure clients, to defend effort, and to ultimately protect pay. But that's not the only way location awareness can be helpful. So let's talk about real-time redeployment. Now, the traditional way of actively deploying workers who are on shift is through a mass broadcast system. For example, a public tannoy system, like you can see on this slide here. Bit old-fashioned now, not many places are using it, but still in some supermarkets. Or more commonly, you might get a network of headsets or radios, again, as you can see in these examples. But whether it's a spillage on aisle 4 that needs cleaning, whether it's a patient that needs transporting to another ward in a hospital or a care home, or whether it's a quick maintenance task that needs completing fairly urgently, the process, generally speaking, to get the help in this situation is to put out some form of mass broadcast. So either radioing out to everybody or putting it out to their headsets. In the hope that one person will be available and nearby to pick that job up. But location awareness is now actually helping busy workplaces to get the right people to the right places at the right times without having to bother the entire network who are on shift. So instead of calling across the shop floor or radioing the entire maintenance team, wouldn't it be better if you had a system that just knew where your workers were, identified the nearest available person for the job and called them over? See, that's not possible when you don't know where your workers are. Right now, for example, here's another example of how this is being used. We have a client who installed a set of service buttons into each of their meeting rooms. Now, these meeting rooms need to be quickly reset once finished with, so table cleaned, fridges restocked, etc. But because their meeting rooms are scattered throughout the building, that's upstairs, downstairs, all over, finding the nearest member of staff to do this can be difficult. So thanks to these smart buttons that they've installed in each room, upon exit, occupants simply hit the button which alerts the nearest member of service staff that this particular room needs a reset, ready for the next guests. There is no need to radio the entire team. There's no need for a public address call out. There's no need to, what more commonly happens in situations like this, rush around the building trying to find somebody who can help. It just gets done. And this smart deployment of staff is being used in all sorts of creative ways in busy workforces by applying accurate indoor location intelligence. It's what I think of as efficiency through precision. So most people might think of productivity boosting tools to mean tools that squeeze as many minutes out of a person as possible, but that's not what location awareness should be enabling. It should be enabling smarter redeployment of your resources so that the right jobs get done by the right people with as little disruption as possible. Now, there's two more short case studies I want to share before I bore you all to death. And the first relates to this picture here, which I suppose not everybody will be familiar with because not everybody uses clocking in machines for timekeeping. You may even see them as a relic from the past, which in some industries they are. But time clocks are still a very real thing in many sectors, especially those who work in large, busy, hands-on environments such as factories, warehouses. Now, one of the problems with physical clock-in machines is the sheer amount of time it takes to queue up and clock in. The bigger the workforce on site, the bigger this problem becomes. One of our clients is a manufacturing plant up near Scunthorpe, and they've had these issues now for years. Big queues at the start and finish of each shift. We're not talking about a problem big enough to shut down their entire operation. We're talking about an annoying delay that's at the start and the finish of each shift. So workers are either fed up that they're having to turn up early in order to clock in, or they're losing pay because they're waiting into their shift before they can clock in. Now, this particular workforce, who we're talking about here, they couldn't just clock in or out using a mobile app. Mobile apps do exist for this kind of thing, but the company can't justify the cost of supplying every single worker with a company phone purely for clocking in purposes. And the majority of their workforce, frankly, can't be bothered with buying the latest model of iPhone for their personal lives. It's expensive, an older model suits them just fine, and so that's what a lot of them do. Meaning that many of these app-based timesheet solutions, even if they were to use them on their personal devices, have a compatibility issue. So what we did for this company was we plugged in 8 different gateways at various workstations, and you can see an example of this in the top right of this slide, throughout the building. Now these gateways required no complex installation, they just plugged into a regular socket, and then we supplied each worker with a low-cost tag, which you can see in the bottom right of this slide, before they slip into their back pocket and take with them on shift. So using this system, workers simply turn up and get started. Sense knows exactly where they are at any given time, and it updates their timesheets accordingly. Now again, for this company, this was not an attempt at pinching pennies. You can understand how many people might think this way. Oh, so the system sees when I visit the bathroom, does it? And it docks my wages. But that's not the reality of what's happening here. The company simply wanted to automate timesheets, and that's what they've done. And their workers at this company actually much prefer this system, especially the ones who were forgetting to clock in and out and were having to write an apology letter to payroll once a week. And this is a great example of how location tracking can actually remove friction, remove suspicion, and remove wasted time. There's no need to prove you were there. The system simply knows. Now, my final story is more of a personal one and involves my youngest sister, who is a mental health nurse in Sheffield. This is not actually a picture of my sister, this is a stock image, and it looks nothing like her. With that disclaimer in mind. My sister loves her job, and she spends her time in the community, visiting vulnerable people in their homes. These people are normally deemed safe, but they do have serious mental health challenges. Sometimes they've just been released from an extended stay in a secure hospital. Other times they may need to be taken into hospital for the safety of themselves and others. Now, as a general rule, my sister will work in a pair with another person, and as a general rule, my sister's boss knows where she's meant to be and where she's going to be next. But until she checks in with her boss, such as by sending a text or making a phone call, her boss has no idea whether she left her last appointment safely. Now, most visits are fine, but occasionally she will find herself having to do a visit alone due to a shortage of staff, and that's normally when she ends up in the home of a person who decides to lock the door and show her their knife collection, for example. That's a true story, by the way. There was no ill intent, and nobody got hurt, but you can probably imagine just how terrifying that was. Mentally ill patients are not always the most stable, and they're not often very trusting of others, especially those in uniform, which means that when my sister feels unsafe, the last thing she wants to do is rouse suspicions further, or rouse paranoia by pulling her phone out of her pocket and sending a message, or even pressing a panic alarm, no matter how discreet it's designed to look. However, if she knows that her supervisor can see her exact location and can see that she's been in her last appointment 10 minutes longer than planned, then that's a real blessing for her. She feels less alone, she feels less vulnerable, and she feels more like there's a fail-safe in place if something goes wrong. So, Census location awareness technology was built with this safety-first approach in mind, so as well as including fall detection, automatic check-ins, call for help buttons, to name a few things, the most important part of Census location awareness technology is this constant broadcast of location to the nearest available colleague when something goes wrong. And this is the way that location tracking helps to protect and support people, especially those who work in isolated areas, dangerous zones or unsafe settings. You see, these people don't want to be lost, they don't want to slip beneath the radar, and they don't want to slack off. These people want to be found. You know, whether you're halfway up an electricity pylon or, out in the middle of a field somewhere, maybe, like the example mentioned, you're visiting a mentally ill person who's just busted out a knife collection, or you might even just be in a distant lodge with a client teaching yoga and there's a stampede of cattle outside. The chances are, in any of these situations, you probably want somebody to know where you are, and you don't much care if you're accused of slacking off, because that's not really your priority. So when it comes to tracking employee location in the workplace, the core question really is, what are you using it for? And that's why I think the answer to this question as to whether it's a good thing or a bad thing is that intent matters. It really, really matters. So what is your intention? If you are tracking an employee's location because you want to police how many times they visit the toilet and scare them into a urinary tract infection, you're probably tracking location for the wrong reason. Likewise, if you're tracking an employee's location so you can make sure they're spending every single minute being productive, or perhaps you're even trying to find reasons to dock their wages, and apologies, there's a word missing off this slide. But chances are you're tracking location for the wrong reasons. And if this is the case, then what you may as well do is install CCTV into every single corridor and devote your entire working life to watching the monitors. However, if you're using location intelligence to prove that work was completed, in order to reduce disputes around timesheets, that's a pretty noble goal. If you're trying to deploy people more effectively by being aware of where the nearest available person is to help, that's a great use of the technology too. If you're trying to automate outdated manual processes or protect lone and vulnerable workers, these are all great ways to use employee tracking technology to better your entire workforce. Not only the output that they produce, but the way that they feel about being at work. So look, this technology, it doesn't come with ethics built in. That part's up to you as the user. If you're using technology to punish people, then they're going to feel it. And let's be fair, if this guy here wants to have a fag break, I don't think any sort of tracking technology you're going to put on him is going to stop him from doing that. However, if you're using this technology to support and improve the workplace, your people will feel that too, but for the right reasons. So, is location technology big brother or big benefits? I think that's for you to decide. All I'll say is that the future of location tracking at work doesn't have to be dystopian. And if you'd like to watch this presentation again, you can find a copy of this at www.sense.tech/bigbrother, and we'd be happy for you to drop us a line with any questions or comments you have. Thanks.